Alrighty, so today, really quickly, you all probably already know what we're here for, but we're trying to make it work, right? A lot of times we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we all might be defining it in different ways, but especially now more than ever with what's happening in our world, in our society, there's a need for us to really center voices and think about how we can structure our organizations. So that's what most of our or all of our conversation will be about today, and we'll specifically talk about our own approach as SGO to DI work, how we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and then move into some of the challenges and opportunities we see when trying to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work in virtual spaces. From there, we'll talk about just tips on facilitating DEI conversations, and not just, just facilitating, but how do you sort of approach this work? And then we'll talk about some examples, right? Some examples are probably as easy as you all can think about it, just because a lot of times some of the work that we're already doing doesn't necessarily need a lot of challenge, but a lot of movement. But what we can do is to think about, well, how do we make sure that we're doing it in a way that makes sense as we're using the virtual settings? And then, as I said before, towards the end, we'll have time for Q&A. All righty, I'll pass it over to you, Felicia, to talk more about how we even think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work at She Geeks Out.
Yeah, so really, in general, the way that we think about and approach this work is we want to be very inclusive and coming at it from a place of non-judgment, non-shame, non-blame. And so, what's been interesting and what we'll dig into a little bit further in just a minute is, how do we support those goals when the conversations and the interactions are happening virtually as opposed to in person? And so really what we've been seeing, especially over the last several months, where a lot of us have been discussing and engaging with each other completely 100% virtually, is that we can still have these conversations and we can still support these goals of inclusiveness, of making sure that we're lifting up voices, of making sure that we're not shaming or blaming, but really coming at this conversation from a place of curiosity and learning. That is really goals that are still able to be maintained, and in some instances can actually be supported a little bit better with the virtual approach. And so we'll talk a bit more about how we think about the work as well as we get into this. But in general, we're really trying to make sure that we are opening up safe yet brave spaces for people to ask questions, have conversations, and engage with each other. But we'd love to hear from you as well, and just get a sense of what are all of you who are on the call or dialed in, how are you thinking about virtual DEI work? And so there should be a poll that's just popped up on your screen. And so this is just kind of a way for us to check in with all of you. And so there's two questions. The first is, my company or organization has used a virtual platform to discuss issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, with the answer options being yes, no, or we're planning to. And then the second question is, our virtual DEI related conversation or engagement was, the options are a success, a failure, somewhere in between, too early to judge, or not sure. And if any of you are dialing in just on phone, just take a minute or so and think to yourself what your answers to these two questions would be. So we'll give it another like 20, 30 seconds just to make sure everyone's had a chance to vote in, and then we'll end and share the results so we can get a sense of where we're all at. All right, so once again, my company organization has used a virtual platform to discuss issues related to DEI. And our virtual DEI related conversation or engagement was fill in the blank. All right, so why don't we give another 5 seconds for any stragglers, and let's end and share out the results. Okay, so first question, have you or have you not used a virtual platform? So just over half of you said yes, 15% said no, and then 27% said we're planning to. Second question, our virtual DEI related conversation was 17% said a success, 2%, one person said a failure, oh no, 17% somewhere in between, just over half of you too early to judge, and 10% not sure. So thank you for sharing that. And it's good for us to hear this too, because this is very much something that's a bit newer for a lot of us and very much a work in progress, which is why we thought it would be helpful for us to come together to talk a little bit about even what are the considerations, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are best practices when thinking about this work from a virtual standpoint.
Awesome.
Okay.
Alrighty. So, Felicia talked a bit about our approach at SGO, and I've been with the team for about a year now. And what I will say before I even jump into challenges and opportunities is that when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, we really center it in justice, right? And really thinking about whose voices are at the margins and how do we center those voices. And also, it's not an initiative. So very often when we think about DEI, we add it as an initiative. And today we really want to talk about, like, how do you embed it, right? Because we know that when you add it as an initiative, especially with what's happening as it relates to the pandemic and all these various things, a lot of folks have been coming to us saying, well, how do you keep DEI at the forefront, right? Like right now we're not even able to do this because we have so many other issues. And so that leads us to why we even want to talk about some of these challenges and opportunities. So really quickly, when we're using virtual platforms, conversations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion are already difficult and can be sensitive for many of us. But it makes it even harder when we're communicating through Zoom or whatever other virtual platform we're using, because we don't have that physical space to have those brave conversations or to address conflict. So you might have had a recent meeting or a conversation with folks, and right now I'm even looking at my screen and some of us are in video, but sometimes when we're having those intimate conversations, we don't always get to see that body language or how people are feeling or how people are reacting. And so we can't tell, right? And so it makes it even harder to talk about things that are so important during these times. Another piece of it is during conversations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or just conversations in general, we're starting to see a lot of biases manifest in different ways, right? And that's through microaggressions, right? What that might happen through calls, that might happen through Zoom meetings, and it's harder to address, right? Because sometimes people are just talking right over each other, and it's hard to sort of gauge the room. Another thing, I know Felicia and I recently read an article, and I don't know if you all read it, but it was an article about how people who identify as women feel like they have to show up to Zoom platforms or meetings, video meetings, fully dressed with makeup and earrings, because there's a societal pressure that you're supposed to look a certain way, right? Well, where does that narrative come from, and how does it make it harder for some of us who might not have the time to do it because our environment has changed, right? A lot of folks are parenting, their parents, they're caregivers, and just in general, there's a lot happening. And so how are these biases manifesting in a way that's not allowing us to do really great work? And then really quickly, and Felicia mentioned it earlier, but this lack of trust and connection, some of us might have done a really great job of building trust before we became mostly or all remote, right? And now we're like, oh, how do I make sure that I create that bond, right? When we were in physical space, for those of us who were in the physical space and working, it was sort of natural for you sometimes to say something to your colleague walking across the hall or sitting next to you. But you have to be more intentional now, right? And if you don't create those pathways and those moments, sometimes it can be harder to have these conversations because you don't feel connected to your colleague or your manager. I'll kick it off to you, Felicia.
Yeah, thanks, Fatima. And actually, I just see, just saw a comment come through asking about that article. So we'll share that link out when we have a chance. So a couple other things to think about from a challenge perspective is exacerbation of harmful culture. And what we mean by that is, and I'm sure a lot of us are probably feeling this very personally and very deeply, just because we may be working from home or from a non-office space does not necessarily mean that we are more productive, that we're going to be putting out the same quality of work, or that even the way we're working is going to be exactly the same as it was before when we were predominantly collectively in in-person environments. And so we've done a lot of talking and thinking about this topic recently, especially over the last few months, but there's definitely this trend where people are thinking, okay, people can actually work more because now they don't have to commute to work, or, now they can just wear their PJs and they're comfortable. But we also have to remember that we're still working in the middle of a global pandemic. And so just as Fatima mentioned, with things like parenting and caregiving and just being out of sorts, some people people don't have a workspace in their homes, or have even space to be doing work in an area that's not also dedicated for eating or for sleeping or something else. So thinking about, as managers, are we micromanaging more because we don't necessarily trust people? Are we viewing levels of productivity the same or not? And are we defaulting to a scarcity mindset, so looking for quantity over quality? Funding is another issue as well. And I know that a lot of us have had a lot of experience at this point around using platforms like Zoom or Google Meetings or Hangouts or other Microsoft Teams, other topics and tools that are out there. But some of us don't have the funding to even be using some of these platforms. And so depending on your organization, on your role, on a lot of other factors, thinking about what are we able to actually support from a standpoint of tools that might be more paid for, or things that we might need to invest in. And then finally, in terms of other challenges, it's really difficult sometimes to interpret tone and body language over screens. I can tell you, as someone who's hard of hearing, it's challenging in person to be wearing masks and talking to each other, but sometimes also the way that someone's saying something, or the tone, or even the rest of our body and how we're present in the space does not come across through a screen. And so we have to almost over communicate when we're thinking about virtually engaging with each other. But we also have to balance out, where are we trying to be inclusive and where might we lose some things because we're being more inclusive rather than gaining. So for example, we're really big on making people feel comfortable, where if you don't want to show up with your video on, that's totally fine, because sometimes you don't want to put the makeup on, or you didn't have a chance to really kind of get out of your PJs before you jumped into the first meeting, or there's some chaos happening behind you, or you didn't fold your laundry, or whatever it might be. And so you might want to have that visual off, or you might even just be tired of watching yourself talk in the corner. And so you just need a break from looking at yourself, to have that break from that cognitive dissonance. But then thinking on the other side of it, it's harder for that person speaking to you to then try and get a sense of, facial expressions or how you're showing up. But these are give and takes that we have to really be much more aware of than we would have been if we were all in person together. And not saying that these issues were never present before the last few months came into play, but they've just become more top of mind and more starkly highlighted. But those are some of the challenges. And if you are also seeing challenges in your own workplace that we didn't touch on, I definitely invite you to put those into the chat box, because these are challenges that we've seen and we've experienced, but that's not to say that they're the end all be all. But there's also a lot of opportunities. And actually, Fatima, do you want to maybe kick us off with some opportunities that we've been seeing in terms of virtually engaging in these conversations?
Absolutely. I'm smiling on this, and thank you for doing all of that, because a lot of times it's so easy to talk about what's not working, right? And using this moment to highlight all the inequities that have existed even before COVID and before, mainstream awareness around social inequities, police brutality, etc. But there's also an opportunity for us to rethink about what we're doing, right? And so want to hone that, and also hold space to acknowledge that we have an opportunity to make things so much better. And one way to do that is for us to be very intentional and creative about the ways we engage, because we're not in the office. And obviously, I don't want to assume that everyone was in the office. Some of you might have mixed offices, or you were already working remotely. So some of you are like already understand that struggle, right? But what does it look like to be like, okay, well, how do I connect with some of my colleagues or employees outside of our normal work hours, right? And how do I do it in a way that acknowledges and honors their experiences, whatever they might be going through? Because maybe once upon a time, folks can go out, for a dinner or a drink, or just hang out after work, or a lunchtime meeting, right? But it's harder to do that now. And maybe you have to be more creative about what that looks like, right? Maybe it's having those moments where you can sit together, office hours. There's companies who are doing office hours now, virtual office hours, where people can just hop in during like 12 to 1, every day to just say hi, engage, maybe have lunch with one another, right? There are different ways that we can make sure we're engaging so that we build that trust in order for us to have these conversations. Another thing that we can think about is recentering and revisiting our organizational values and missions, right? I think within the last 2, 3 weeks, we've gotten an increase or influx, I should say, of inquiries as it relates to trainings and as it relates to just having anti-racist knowledge because of what's happening in our country, right? And so a lot of us are within companies and organizations where we're saying, oh, pause. We might have said we're doing X, Y, and Z, but does that align with our practice? Does that align with our policies? Does that align with what's happening right now? And if not, what should we be rethinking to make sure that we are doing the work appropriately? And then that goes into other ways to receive feedback, right? You don't know what's working and what's not working unless if you have pathways to hear from your employees. So it's not just having formal feedbacks where you're sending out those surveys and having people fill it out, whether it's anonymous or not, but also having an opportunity for people to share informally. Now, it's a little bit tricky now because, if you were in a physical space in an office, some folks might have like a suggestion box or different ways where people can informally just share things. Maybe you have a lunchroom where on a refrigerator, folks are sharing ideas or articles. It looks a little bit different now. So what can you do to make sure that people have all ways to communicate the way they're feeling? Obviously, this can be a challenge. So going back to challenges for folks who have smaller teams, right? Because with us, it's basically 4 of us that are on the team. So me and Felicia and I were joking earlier because we were like, whether we had an anonymous survey or not, everyone would know sort of who is saying what. So how do you build that trust within your team so that it's okay to have those conversations, even if they're uncomfortable and quote unquote awkward? And then lastly, how do we think about exploring alternative methods of communication? And I'll let Felicia continue on with this note. I think you're mute. Awesome.
Yes, another opportunity is to do what we love talking about here at SGO and really lean into the awkward because things will happen. It's just the nature of our new normal, so to speak. So when we're thinking about communicating, one other thing that we really see this as an opportunity is because we're not necessarily limited to just those in-person interactions or just email or just a phone call or just even a video engagement as we might have been before. There are so many other ways that we can be communicating with each other. And so I know that a lot of companies have actually been really creative around this, and they've been doing meetings in alternative platform spaces like Animal Crossing or Skyrim or other Twitch or using other platforms that are out there, because now we're realizing, okay, maybe it doesn't necessarily matter so much where or how we gather as long as we are gathering and working together and sharing information. We've also seen a pretty big influx in interest around things like pairing up different platforms and channels of communication. So in addition to having a video discussion where people are joining in and watching over video, then we can also maybe pair that with Slack or pair it with something else. So there's a lot of other ways to communicate that we could now explore that. Not only is it something where we can just, extend our creativity, but we're also seeing organizations that may not have really thought of themselves as being innovative or creative are now seeing that, oh, really, there's a whole new world as far as how that might be opening up for us. One really quick note before we move on, and I did see a comment or two asking about captioning. Unfortunately, it's not working right now. We do have the feature, but it is, like I said, the awkwardness is very real. It's not working. So apologies if you are hard of hearing and are looking for access to that. We will send out the link to this afterwards with the integrated audio transcript, so you'll have that available to you. So just wanted to quickly name that and let you all know.
Perfect. Thanks so much for naming that, Felicia. And our apologies because we want to make sure that this content is accessible. I know I just received a message from someone that sent us an email with some other resources if Zoom isn't working. So we'll be sure in the future to make sure that we have that ready.
All right.
Alrighty. So what do we do, right? Now that we have an opportunity to make things better, or at least work with what we have, a lot of times people ask us, how do we facilitate conversations related to diversity, equity, inclusion? And generally, how do we support DEI work in virtual ways? So the first thing we like to say is get started, right? There was a recent article that came out, I'm happy to drop the link once I pause, about, there's a lot of folks are reaching out for anti-racist trainings, and people who have been doing this work already, but is everyone else ready? And I think there's a quote somewhere that says, like, racism isn't going to end in August, so we might as well get started before August, or in August, right? So get started. I know there's a lot of fear. I know it's hard, and I know that we don't want to make mistakes. I want to be very honest and transparent that mistakes will be made, even when you're taking the most delicate steps, just because it's not an easy topic to address, especially when we're talking about inequities and trying to right the wrongs, right? So there are going to be moments where we make mistakes, but we won't know how we're going to grow unless if we get started. When we do get started, we have to be sure that we know even what we're doing. Often people are like, okay, I know I have to do something, but I don't know what I need to do. First, be clear on what you and your employees need. What does your organization need, right? Some of us might be doing some assessments, organizational assessments, whether both informal or formal, to see, what's happening, right? Let's have a temperature check to see how people are doing. Did we respond well when the George Floyd event happened? Did we respond well when COVID pandemic hit? Are we, giving the resources that people need? What does our one-on-one meetings look like? And really having a broad scope of what does our culture look like, and what are people asking us to do, and how can we make sure that that happens, right? And then from there, you start thinking about, well, now that we have an idea of what we need to do, we need to make it happen, but you just can't make everyone do it, right? You want to first make sure that it's embedded within your company, especially if you haven't done this work before. So the first thing, but I would probably even put this at the top if get started wasn't as important, is you want to provide people with financial and psychological support. There are so many people who are doing this work right now that aren't able to do the work because they're not supported, because they're grieving with things that are happening in their communities, while also providing support for their company. And even if they want to do something, they're not getting the finances or the financial support to make the work successful, right? And so what does it look like to assess what you need, and then make sure that you have all the support that you need, and not just leaving it to one person, especially if it's not their job. If you have, for example, a chief officer of diversity, equity, and inclusion, obviously some of these things might be under their roles, but they can't do it all by themselves, right? And it's not a separate thing. It should be part of your company and organization. So maybe it's creating a committee. Maybe it's thinking about a working group that can also support the chief of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on. And then once you figure out what that looks like, and you start thinking about, well, now let's have these conversations, it's really important to create guidelines. When we do our trainings and workshops, we call these suggested community guidelines. And it's just a way for us to think about, how do we want to share space? Because each of us are coming to these conversations with our own identities, our own backgrounds, privilege, non-privilege experiences, and so on. And so we have to be very tender in how we approach these situations, but also brave, right? So not being so careful that you don't want to have these conversations, but careful enough that you're taking this very seriously, and people know that you're taking it seriously. So a few examples might be like, making space for people to talk, one mic, right? Or switching roles when you're having meetings, like not just one person talking over another, or leading that meeting. These are different guidelines that you can have each time you're having meetings. And we'll talk more about examples of what DEI work can look like. So I'll pass it over to you, Felicia, to finish up this slide.
Great, thanks, Fatima. So next thing we want to talk about is prioritizing individuals and groups that are impacted the most. And this is where we're seeing this, and this is again, just facilitating transparently in real time. We have some people who could use our closed captions on this webinar, and as we can see, it doesn't always work. That was an example of one of our guidelines. Someone was asking about examples, is really embracing the awkward and trying to roll with it, because we're not going to get it right all the time at all moments. And so really trying to figure out how can we adjust and do better in the future. But with that being said, how can we really make sure that we are supporting people who need the help the most? And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Working and doing the work to get towards an actionable goal. And so this is where this, I think, is important no matter whether the facilitation or the conversation is happening virtually or in person or in some kind of a blend. But really thinking about how can you make sure that you're putting in place things that are tangible that you can work towards, and it's not just a vague generality like, oh, we want to do better, or we want to be more diverse, or we want to be more inclusive. But what does that actually tie back to when we're talking about specifics? And this next point, I think, supports that, which is collect quantitative and qualitative data, both formally and informally. And so if you are working at an organization that is already doing some data collection, great. Thinking about, are you actually analyzing it? Or is it just sitting somewhere? Or is it being held in more of a gatekeeping situation where maybe only HR has access to it, or only people ops has access to that data, or only a subset of people have access to that? If you haven't really done a ton of collection, then there's, no time like the present to get started. So thinking about employee engagement surveys, pulse surveys, anything that you can start looking at if you're involved in hiring, looking at your pipeline and seeing who's getting through each stage, who are you hiring, who are you not hiring. There's a ton of different places to start thinking about there. Really also think about embedding this within the fabric of your organization. So DEI work, we are really strong believers that this should not be an add-on or a nice to have. It's something that really needs to be built in from the ground up. So what does that mean to embed it, especially if you're working at an organization that's never done this before? Again, because we're all virtual, there's certain things that we can start thinking about to get this process going. And part of it is thinking about, okay, well, your organization may have had directives or initiatives that were relating to how do we run meetings or how do we engage with each other. But a lot of organizations are actually creating these guidelines and creating these approaches from scratch. And so is there a way to build in some support from that creation process as opposed to doing it after it's already been pre-created, excuse me. And then finally, prep. And the reason I include this is just because no matter how much you plan for every eventuality, you're not going to be able to think about every last single thing that will happen. And so doing as much prep work in advance as you can possibly do, especially for things like running trainings or workshops. We do a lot of that work. And so one thing that we're trying to do always is figure out how can we anticipate what might come up, whether it's Wi-Fi issues, whether it's people not being able to get into the meeting itself for whatever reason. We do a lot of prep work with our clients when we're doing work like this to make sure that does everyone have access to this kind of technology? Is everyone able to dial in? That's not a given even still in our society today. And so just trying to think about what are all those eventualities and how can we plan as much as we can for them. And there are certainly many other ways we can be thinking about supporting virtual work. And if there are other thoughts, please, of course, feel free to share them in the chat as well. Let's review some different examples of how we can think about doing this work virtually.
Perfect.
All right. Great. Do you want to kick us off on this, Fatima?
Yeah, sounds good. And I know this is pretty active in the chat box. I appreciate all the sharing that's happening. I ask that we continue to share through the chat box because, as we mentioned, this live conversation isn't necessarily accessible to all. And again, we apologize for that. But so things aren't lost in translation in real time, please feel free to ask your questions and share your ideas here. And I'll do my best as well to summarize some things in the chat box so we can make sure folks feel that they're engaged as much as possible. So obviously the examples that you see here are not necessarily the only ways DEI work can happen. But the reason why we chose these examples is because it's a lot of questions that we've received from clients in our larger community where they're trying to have these conversations through these ways, right? And so how can you even do this when these conversations are sensitive, topics are sensitive, as I mentioned earlier? And the first way a lot of folks have access about is employee resource groups. So you also see that we have affinity spaces at the bottom. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but for the most part, a lot of ERGs, which is short for employee resource groups, is a way for people to have conversations related to the workplace and how it impacts their livelihood, right? So some folks might have employer resource groups related to, being a parent, or being Black, Latina, related to race, gender, sexual orientation. And what does it mean for us to make sure that we have a company or workplace that allows us to feel included and is actively making changes so that we feel included, right? And so sometimes people use these ERGs as a way to move their company or organization in a more positive direction. Another way that DEI work is happening is through trainings, and we have now shifted to doing all of our workshops or trainings, depending on which word you prefer, through virtual platforms. And usually we use Zoom, but we've also had an opportunity to use WebEx as well. And we try to make sure that we make those trainings as accessible as possible and as interactive as possible. So as Felicia mentioned, we usually try to have the Zoom captioning, but with technology, sometimes these things don't happen. So how do you make space to make sure that you have accommodations? Like right now, we're literally having that experience right now, right? But then also, how do you make it engaging? So we try to have breakout rooms to make sure that everyone doesn't feel like they have to share right now in a large space, but some of us think differently. Some of us are introverts. Some of us process differently. So we have those breakout sessions to talk to one another, to process some of these things. Another example is book club discussions, right? We always talk about when things happen, we are very quick to want to make changes institutionally, but we don't realize that we also have our own individual work to do, right? And so the job is not on folks who have been marginalized or within marginalized communities to do the work, right? But it's also our own individual responsibility to read and understand historical implications of what's happening now and how that impacts our colleagues, our employees, and the larger community we might be serving. So a lot of times these are informal and optional, but having a monthly book club discussion where you're picking specific books related to diversity, equity, inclusion. I think in the start of 2020, we sent out a list of books, and I'll drop that link again in the chat box, where we said, these are some books that might get the conversation going within workplaces. Here are a list of books that you can start reading, right? And so that's another way to have these conversations. And obviously you want to think about who's facilitating, what facilitation looks like. You want to be able to pick a time that works for everyone. So sending out that quick survey to say, hey, like, we want to do this. This is part of our longer term goal. This is not just a one-time thing, but who's interested? What books are we reading? Who might be facilitating? What are some questions we might want to ask? And having that working document that's shared with everyone. And then lastly, affinity spaces, which is an opportunity for folks who sometimes just don't have the energy to always talk in a larger group, right? Sometimes you want that affinity space to talk to people who might be experiencing the same thing like you. And what does that look like? How do you create that space? And not just having those conversations, but is your company or organization in a place to bring in an external person, for example, so that someone in the organization isn't always having to do the facilitation while also processing, right? And are there other resources that your company can either pay for or direct people towards so that they feel supported? Like for me, I can say there are a lot of virtual healing spaces that are occurring right now as it relates to Black police brutality in the Black community. And so folks are sending resources to people to say, hey, here are some other spaces that exist outside of the workplace. These are just resources. They're putting it up on their website. They're sending it out as an email to employees. So folks know that, like, not only do we want to support you here, but in the event that you don't feel comfortable to have these conversations, what does it look like for us to help you and support you in those ways? And Felicia, I'll let you kick it off on the other side as I address the chat box as well.
Yeah, and I'm actually just sharing in a list of the some book ideas in the chat box, so feel free to take a look at that. Some other ways that we can be thinking about supporting and running and doing this work virtually is through organizational assessments and audits. And so one thing that we've been really thinking a lot about, especially over the last few months, is how much of this DEI work, how much of this inclusion and equity work really doesn't stop just because we might be more virtual than we were before. It's just more around how do we continue it, how do we support it, and how do we maybe shift a little bit depending on if we were more used to doing things in person versus not. So things like organizational assessments, audits, those are things that do not need to be held in person so they can continue to go on. And this is another great starting point for organizations, especially if you've never done anything in this work, is you start with just figuring out, where are you right now? What is your baseline? You can look at things like pay equity, promotions, who's getting promoted, who's not, is pay equitable across the board, or is it not? And these are two examples of places you can start, but there's a lot of other areas to work into when you're looking at how to assess your organization as a whole. Watch parties are very much related to sort of book club discussions, but we've been seeing that this is another great way for people to come together and have conversations around this work, but it's a little bit more structured in a way. And so one thing that we've been doing within the She Geeks Out community over the past few months is we've been holding virtual watch parties where we pick a movie, a documentary, some kind of virtual piece to all watch together. We've set a set time. So we'll say, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And then one thing we've been doing to actually augment a watch party is we've also had a shared, in this case, a shared Slack channel where we are able to talk and comment with each other in real time as we're all watching and processing whatever it is that we've chosen. That's been a really fun, engaging way to be part of this conversation and to actually start unpacking and sharing resources and sharing articles and just sharing reactions with people. Other ways to do this beyond just everyone starting on their own and using a shared Slack channel, you could do this over Netflix. And so Netflix is actually supporting virtual watch parties with a few of your friends or people that you join in with. So that's one thing to be thinking about. We most recently have watched things like 13th from Ava DuVernay. And there's a lot of other things out there, or a lot of other documentaries and great video content out there to process and work through together. And then finally, engagement surveys. And so really thinking about, how can we make sure that we're hearing from everyone? How can we make sure that we're not just making assumptions on behalf of everyone, and constantly checking in with people, not from the standpoint of doing it ad nauseum, but from the standpoint of making sure that we're hearing where people are at, we're adjusting to their needs if those needs are changing. And I think that we can all agree that life has changed pretty quickly over the past few months. And so really being receptive to that and understanding that what your team or what your colleague or what your boss or what your direct reports might need today to be supported could look very different tomorrow or next week or next month. And so continuously engaging in this check-in process to make sure that we're staying on top of that. But these are just a couple examples that we've come up with. And so with the time we've left, we'd love to invite you all to ask any questions you have by either continuing to share in the chat box or even unmuting yourself if you have some thoughts or questions that you'd like to share with us. And I actually saw a question come in a little bit earlier from Melissa, so maybe we can start with that one. So Melissa had asked, what would you suggest for organizations that are primarily white? DEI is incredible, vital, and part of our key values of the volunteer organization, but as their membership is now primarily white and they're working on that, she worries it might come off more as virtue signaling than helping to make change, but she also still really wants to pursue this virtual DEI work. Yeah, that's definitely a very common question, and I think a very valid question, Melissa. And I think that what we have to remember, and what we talk a lot about with SGO, is not placing undue burden on different populations of people. So a lot of times what we tend to default to just as human beings is we look for people to help us learn if we're coming at this from a place of curiosity. But if you're coming at this from a place of curiosity because you have some dominant group memberships and identities where you've never maybe had to think about systemic oppression or racism or equality or equity within the workplace, then that's your privilege. And so it's great that you may be here to have the conversation and to learn more, but also recognize that part of that process is doing the work yourself first. And so, there's things that we're sharing in the chat box. There's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of documents and resources that are being shared collectively. But I would say just being really upfront and transparent about it. And especially with this organization that you referenced, Melissa, I would say something like, be really upfront and say, we're predominantly white. We're hoping to change that. Talk about what you're actually doing to try to rethink that or to reshift your population. Say, we're going to be looking at where do we advertise for members, or what does the membership process look like, or how much does membership cost? And I'm just coming up with some of these questions off the top of my head. So of course, some of them may or may not be more or less relevant for you, but starting to share what you're doing, be open to hearing feedback and to hearing from your current membership, as well as people you might want to be part of your group. And then be open about the fact that you're doing the work and that you're not relying on underrepresented members of your membership group or your organization to do the work for you. It's a work in progress. And so that's what I would suggest. But Fatima, if you have any other thoughts to add to that, of course, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I love what you just said. And, recognizing that, a lot of times when we hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, and Felicia, if you alluded to this, just really want to hone into this point, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just about race. Obviously, when we think about the journey of diversity, equity, inclusion workshops and trainings and now being embedded within our companies and organizations, it did start from racial relations in this country. It did start through the civil rights movement, and we're now realizing that how do we talk about intersectionality? So for a group who, is predominantly white or all white, how do they hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just as a race issue, but as an intersectional issue as well, right? Where we have to understand that it's not just we want to talk about race, but folks who are Black, brown, or other non-white ethnicities and races are also queer, are also women, are also differently abled, and so on, right? And so folks have to understand that in order for us to do this work, we don't necessarily have to be the group that feels like we're either marginalized or whatever other term makes sense in order for us to do this work. Because what we know is that when we work towards, and I'll say, when we work towards liberation or equity within our companies and organizations, it benefits all of us. So if your company and organization is doing all right, and they're like, well, what do we need to be doing better? And as much as I don't care for the business case of diversity, equity, and inclusion, unfortunately, or fortunately, sometimes that's what lands for folks. So having folks understand that not only is this morally what we should be doing, but also if we do this increase engagement. This helps us understand the clients that we're working with, the community that we're working with, and it allows us to do our own internal work for a future that we want to see within our company, right? And so I think also aligning it in that way might help folks understand the need for DEI work, even if they don't necessarily see themselves within some of those communities I just mentioned.
Thanks, Fatima. And I think next there was a question from Sarah. So Sarah, feel free to chat or unmute yourself.
Great, thank you so much, Felicia. And I'm not sure if this was Fatima, if it was you or Felicia, but one of you had framed this question about, are we resorting to a scarcity mindset? And I highlighted that because I have this question when we're doing work in conferences where there are a lot of white people who are fairly new to looking at themselves. They may have done work in other ways or whatever, but I feel like doing the inward journey is harder. You had talked about it's okay and we want to have people feel comfortable, and we certainly do, to not be on video so that they can be comfortable if they're just needing to take care of small kids and they're in their pajamas, or all those scenarios that you guys painted. But there is also this thing about people sharing difficult things in spaces when some people's faces are present and some people's aren't. That's really difficult to navigate, and I just wonder if you guys could speak to that a little bit. That'd be really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just typing up your question to share in the chat as well, Sarah. So thank you for that. Give me one moment.
Of course. While you're typing, I'm happy to start off if that's better.
You.
Of course. I hear everything that you're saying, Sarah, and it is hard sometimes to have these conversations, especially if people are sharing things that everyone isn't ready to hold or might not have the tools to navigate those conversations. In those moments, if there's no one internally to sort of address or figure out how to do it, a lot of times there needs to be some type of coaching, right? That needs to happen, whether that's from an external person or someone within the company. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times this is the first time people are having to have these conversations, right? Like it's almost as if because we're working through Zoom, you're seeing people's backgrounds, their homes, and what's going on. You can't ignore, right? The personal and professional have always been connected, but now more than ever, they're blurring together, right? And so I would say if folks, especially if they're managers or exec teams, are not feeling comfortable or don't feel like they have the tools to address it, I definitely think some coaching for leadership teams on an individual level to think about, well, what is that barrier that's not allowing me to have these conversations? What do we have within our company to help have these conversations? Is HR a good resource? If not, what trainings does HR have? And how are we sort of making sure that we're seeing people as human, right? But then what are some ways we can give feedback? So recently, Felicia and I did a training, and one of the things we talked about is starting off with a disclaimer almost, right? So before you even start sharing, to ask someone, are you in this headspace or the position for me to share something right now that might harm you, or that might be detrimental to you, or that might bring up emotional issues? And I really think it's so important to do that now, because we don't always know if someone is in that space. And if they're not in that space, the way they respond to you can either harm, make it worse, or at least make it better. So always ask. And even when we're sharing, right? Let folks know that right now I need to just share and vent. Is it okay? Do you have the capacity for me to do that? Because sometimes people don't want that response. They don't want you to tell them what they need to do. They just want someone to speak to. Now, obviously, this becomes a larger issue as it relates to how we're emotionally dealing with this, because there's only so much that a manager or an HR person can do. I want to be very clear, and as someone from a public health background, that some of these issues does affect our health, our emotions. It raises our cortisol levels, and at that point, we do need sometimes professional help. And it's okay to talk about it in that manner. There's a person who does recovering from racism. One of our co-CEOs shared it with us, and really thinking about any type of oppression, but specifically racism as a mental illness. And that's how she's framing it. And how do we have these conversations with folks who are either perpetuating or experiencing racism? And that sometimes people need that emotional help. And we know now through research, through health articles, that this is impacting folks on a level that it's not just enough to have that one-on-one meeting, but supporting folks, asking them what they need, how can you help, can sometimes help as well. Now I'll pass it over to Felicia.
Yeah, thanks, Fatima. And just another quick note to wrap up that thought for your question, Sarah. You know, people are dealing with a lot these days. There's Zoom fatigue, there's virtual fatigue, there's the global pandemic, there's people processing just a lot of trauma, processing rioting, processing family stuff. So a lot is going on. And so I think we have to just remember that when we're signing into a meeting, we might have an unconscious or conscious expectation that everyone will be showing up in a certain way. But we have to just remember that because someone might have put their video off, it's probably has nothing to do with us or nothing to do with the work. It's just more about how are we all showing up and how can we really be present. And if that means we are present visually, great. If it means we're present in other ways, then that's probably okay too. And so just, again, being really just transparent and vulnerable and communicative around these expectations and how we're all engaging with each other. There are a couple other questions that came through. So I'm going to start with the one I saw right after Sarah's note, which was from Rachel, asking, for companies that are really cost conscious and revenue driven versus culture and people driven, what tips do we have to keep leadership engaged and focused on and committed to DEI work long term? Yeah, I think there's definitely, there is a lot of DEI work that needs funding and needs monetary support, but we can also do things around these topics that don't necessarily need to have budget. The outcomes and how it's achieved will probably look a little bit different, but one thing I would say is, in general, what we're seeing is that it looks like the sea change is happening amongst companies, where before we were seeing a lot of organizational leaders saying, well, yes, of course, I think DEI is important, but when push comes to shove, we have to make this deadline. We have to put this project out. We have to make this release date. So it's one of the first things to get put aside. What we've been seeing in the last month or two is that companies are starting to really recognize that you can't just have DEI as a nice to have or an aside, and that if you really want to be successful in today's world, it requires placing some kind of emphasis or consideration or thought process around this work and what it means. And for a lot of companies, that also means putting some money behind it and not just assuming that people within the organization will do the work for you. And so I think that just really, if your leadership team is not there yet, just keep pushing them, because this is something where, we're seeing the power of voices, where people have been speaking up for a long time, but now their voices are being heard in a way that maybe they haven't been heard beforehand. And so push your leadership and just keep it going, and just make sure that this is a long-term sustained effort as opposed to a short-term check the box or nice to have. And that's part of that is what kind of conversations are happening internally. And if they're not quite bought in, looking for why, what's that resistance? Where are they coming from? What is the reasoning behind it? I know there's a lot of messages coming through.
I'm trying to keep up with the chat, so I'm happy to take the next question.
Great.
And probably just combine the two, of course. Rachel, I see your question about companies that are very cost conscious and revenue driven versus culture people driven. What tips do you have to keep leadership?
I just unpacked that one a little bit.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for naming that. And then there's one that someone mentioned about Dublin. About HubSpot's Dublin office, and seeing racism as an American problem versus anything else, and how do you get them to see it? Two resources that I'll plug out there, and I'll drop the link. One is dismantlingracism.com. Literally, if anyone is trying to understand the various ways that racism manifests on various levels and understanding the history, that's a great way to have folks understand how racism is not just a US problem, but it's a construct across our nations, and it manifests very differently. But also, the United Nations has a lot of work around what it means to name this as a human rights issue, and different initiatives that are happening globally, right? And so a lot of times folks need to understand that these issues are happening, and even if they're not happening in the way the US is explaining it, it's happening in a different context. And so giving people that information and tools for them to understand how it's manifesting then allows folks to understand that. And then, quite frank, globalization, right? We all travel from various places. So even if it's manifesting differently in another country, people are going in and out of countries and experiencing the way they experience those countries based on how people perceive them. So even if it's not as explicit and the history is different, there are different ways that it might be manifesting. So it's a question of, what resources and news articles are out there to sort of pull those things out. I think here in the US, we might be having more conversations compared to other countries, but that doesn't mean that other countries don't have a racial issue.
Yeah. And then I think I saw another question come through. And apologies if we already answered this one, let me know. I think I saw a question come through from Kim asking how to make sure that the ideas in the books that we had shared, a list of books, are internalized rather than just having people cover their basis. Yeah, and I think, feel free to share if I'm not quite understanding your question, Kim, but I think that concept comes up quite a bit where, how do we really make sure that people are going to be changing versus just, sort of saying, okay, great, I'm going to read the book too, or I'm going to do the training too, and then I'll just check the box and solve it. And, there's a lot of research out there that shows that even when people are attending sessions and they don't really want to be there, they're still taking that learning and they're still taking it in to some extent. And there's also research out there that shows that even if you have a training, for example, and not every single person joins because they're not all completely bought in, the effects of that sort of training will still percolate out to the rest of the organization, even when not every last single person is part of that conversation to begin with. So really thinking about, what are those first steps and how do we sort of get in the door to start having conversations? And a lot of that comes from a place of curiosity.
I guess, sorry to talk over you, but really quickly, I guess like more what I'm looking for is like accountability when it comes to book clubs, because like it can be such a nice, fun thing to do, but then it kind of drops off. Someone in the chat actually gave me like a discussion outline instead, which I thought was helpful.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I know we're right at time, so I do want to name that as well. Did we get all the questions, or were there another question or two?
I think maybe I just wanted to comment really quickly, and Michelle, appreciate all the sharing that you're sharing, because want to name that, yes, some of these resources, especially the UN, has come into conversation around some of the specific departments and research that's going on that has racist undertones, and want to name that, yes, some of these resources that are part of organizations, can also have racist undertones, and unfortunately still have a long way to go and a lot of work to do. So yes, want to name that even though we're sharing these resources, it doesn't negate the fact that folks have work to do.
Absolutely. All right. So I think that given that we are just a minute or two over time, we're going to probably wrap things up. If we did not get to your question, or if we did not answer your thought process or your last questions, feel free to send us a follow-up email at facilitators@shegeeksout.com. You can also take a look on our website. We're doing a ton of events, all virtual for the time being, and probably through next year. And so our next event coming up at the end of the month is a virtual meetup. So if you're able to join, would love to see you there. It is free to attend. Again, any questions, any thoughts, feel free to shoot us an email. Thank you so much for sharing space with us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.